Hello everybody, my name is Manu and welcome to another Eternal Top Decks video series. Before I dive into the deck that I'm going to talk about today, I want to briefly mention this is likely going to be the last video with the limited production values that I had so far. I just recently managed to invest into a new gaming headset and also a better webcam. Partially thanks to a very nice donation by Eric Kachaba. So shout out to him, thanks for supporting my channel and making it possible for me to upgrade my equipment with the help of his donation and some of my own money. So this should drastically improve production values going forward. As you have already noticed, I also improved my editing quality a bit lately with some nice intro slides and like fade outs to just make the stuff look a little more appealing, smooth and professional. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. And yeah, you can expect an uptick in production values probably come next week. I hope the shipping doesn't take too long, so I maybe will get the headset by the beginning of the week and the webcam maybe by mid or end of the week, so that this will hopefully be the last video series with the old equipment. Maybe I will have to do another one with the old equipment until the new stuff arrives. If it takes too long, we'll see, because I have one or two ideas queued up that I want to do. So we'll see. Alright, so that's it for the news for now. So get excited about higher production values together with the new improved editing to make these videos hopefully much more enjoyable for my viewers going forward. Alright, so let's dive into the deck. As you already noticed by the title, this is going to be an upgrade on the old Rakano Aggro, which has faded a lot in popularity, a lot in success, and definitely is in need of an upgrade. This time, though it wasn't me that figured out the majority of like where to move the archetype, it was Unearthly himself. Like, as you remember last time, it was like my take on the archetype that vastly revamped the understanding of the archetype, the power numbers, and some of these things. So this time it was Unearthly that didn't want to give up on the deck when it was kind of doing more and more poorly, dropped in popularity, and he came up with sort of a more Voltron-like approach, basically dropping Sword of Icaria, which was something we discussed together, and him working further on it while I basically kind of didn't put much thought or time into the archetype, and him coming up with like a more Silverwing familiar centered build, since, as you all know, my opinion on Silverwing familiar very well. It only basically works if you have a really high amount of cards that make it good, because the card itself is basically not worth a card. It's just kind of like a carrier for weapons, basically. It's a pretty good carrier, but it's a terrible card without equipment, without weapons, basically. So yeah, Unearthly has been running and testing this for quite a while. His list was slightly raw in its tuning, so all I did basically was like some fine-tuning to streamline his idea a bit. I'll talk about that in a moment. Like, basically what I did to streamline the deck a bit more is he was running 4 Vanquish for the longest time, which I never agreed with and never liked. So the first thing I did is cut the Force Vanquish for Force Finest Hour. He was only running 3, since basically Finest Hour most of the time does what Vanquish does for 1 power less, and also is much more flexible and dead a lot less often, and also much better against the vastly popular Armory to fight back against the relic weapons. And the other thing I did basically is cut the second Crownwatch Cavalry for 29's power, simply because this deck is even more power hungry than the old Rakano was, simply because it has less 1-drops. It is more centered around 3 and 3 to 5 power cost basically, has an additional 5 drop, has overall more dependency on hitting this 4th and 5th power to play the Haymaker cards to make Familiar shine. So having that 29th power is a pretty big deal and has felt really good and right with the deck. And Unearthly basically agrees with these changes by now, and I think adopted them himself. Like after his last ETS, he was very unhappy with 4 Vanquish and even lost 1 or 2 games because of running so many Vanquishes, and agreed that I was right with suggesting to cut 1 for Finest Hour. And yeah, basically the cut with the Crownwatch is basically to decrease the heaviness on the 4 drops slightly. And also the problem with Crownwatch Cavalry is, while the card can be super game breaking, it can also be kind of low impact, so you want to kind of reduce the chance of having it in your opening hand or drawing it too early when it doesn't have a Warcry trigger yet, because then it's kind of weak. But it is a great card to have in your deck to potentially draw with like 1 or more Warcry triggers on it at some point, because if this, for example, has 2 Warcry triggers, it's a huge game changer. Dropping a 4 power 4/4 that also gives you a +4/+4 boost to one of your units in play already is often going to just win the game on the spot, because the tempo swing and pressure that it generates is just so huge. So it's really nice to have access to, but it's not too great to have all the time, because it needs some setup to really shine. And Scepter is similar, but a bit more like consistent, since it provides like 2 health less in stats than the Cavalry does, but it provides 2 Warcry triggers on top of that. So that's a pretty big gain. So all in all, Scepter is slightly more powerful without Warcry. With Warcry triggers, Cavalry is better. Also, Cavalry is a unit, so you don't need a unit in play. So if you're light on units, you can always just drop a Cavalry on an empty board, while a Scepter doesn't work that way. That's why there's basically like a 3-1 split. Other than that, the deck basically dropped the Pyro Knights, the Sword of Icarius, to make room for Silverwing familiars and the Scepter, the Scepters, and like an additional plate. And from like my old list, basically the 2nd Cavalry is gone to make room for the 29th power. So yeah, the deck basically plays a lot more like the Voltron type decks that I have been recording with. As you can see, I even saved it as Rakano Voltron, because I wanted to differentiate it from potential more traditional Rakano Aggro builds that I might be testing. And yeah, it's much more like build your big monster with Aegis preferably and ride it to victory, than the old Rakano that was more of a traditional good stuff aggro deck that just used the best weapons and Hammer of Might and Deepforged Blade to swing the momentum in game in its favor and just generate some power and tempo plays basically, because it had no familiars to rely on that. So the biggest difference between this deck and the old Rakano is this deck is vastly superior against the majority of Stone Skull variants out there, which is why Unearthly built it this way and came up with it, because he was looking for a way to succeed with Rakano in a metagame full of Burn Queen and Jido and like a bunch of Stone Skull midrange. And this deck does exactly that basically. He has been slaughtering Burn and Burn Queen with this deck, and it's incredible in that matchup. And it's also a lot better against Stone Skull midrange and Jido, while these matchups are still like not super favorable. They are quite good. Like midrange might be slightly favorable, and Jido is kind of draw dependent, but you now have the potential and the draws to completely obliterate them. And put up a fight on a more consistent basis. So while like Jido was a pretty bad matchup before, it's probably an even to favorable matchup now at least. So yeah, keep in mind this version is basically optimized for a Stone Scar heavy metagame, especially an aggressive Stone Scar heavy metagame. If that is not what you're expecting or facing, I would consider going back to something more traditional, like the old version that you can still find on my channel, because that is definitely a more well-rounded, balanced approach, while this is like more of an all-in anti-aggro, anti-Stone Scar approach that is definitely gonna be weaker against some other variants. Like, I would assume that the 8-1 drop more aggressive approach from the old version, for example, should do better against Armory than this version, for example, because cards like Silverwing Familiar are really, really poor against Armory's weapons. They can even kill them without even losing their weapon, and then you have these weapons in your hand that you can't put on anything and stuff. So having a cheaper, more aggressive, more efficient game plan certainly should help there. But yeah, I mean, I have been doing reasonably fine against Armory even so far, so it's definitely not terrible against Armory. But if you don't expect a lot of burn and Jido type decks, it might make sense to convert back to the old version, because this version is built to have an advantage against those, and if you're not facing them much, there's not that much point in these things. Maybe I'll explain the changes real quick. Pyro Knight basically has the problem of being kind of weak against Stone Scar decks. They have their Varus favor, so they can punish you a lot. It cannot always attack because they often have blockers that hold it back, even with like Finest Hour as a backup. Oni Ronin is just a concession to how well it snowballs with Warcry, and that it's good to have at least one 1-drop and have enough units in the deck in total. So Oni Ronin stayed, but Pyro Knight went to reduce the low impact cards in this matchup, especially because you cannot really beat them on a fair angle. Decks like Burn Queen, especially Burn Queen, also has grenade in drones, which makes Pyro Knight even worse. So having less X1s is pretty good there. The next change is basically Sword of Icaria. Sword is kind of a mediocre card to begin with, to be honest. It's great if it gets a bunch of Warcry triggers, because then it becomes a really powerful removal tool, but without, it's kind of a weak card in that it basically deals 3 damage for 3 power, which is a pretty weak rate. Sure, we get a Warcry trigger, but we also potentially take some damage to the face. So the main deal of having Sword of Icaria is getting Warcry triggers on it, and the fact that it's like a non-unit threat against more removal-heavy controlling decks, where you have the time like Felon Control and stuff, and Icaria Blue and such, where Sword of Icaria can really shine. But yeah, against these Stone Scar decks, it is not particularly good. It usually only kills 1 and 2 drops, and other than that, it's mostly just gonna rot in your hand a lot, so it's not great. And even against Jido, where you have a lot of targets, it's still gonna trade really poorly on tempo. You're gonna kill like a 1-drop with a 3-drop, which is not a winning strategy in this matchup. So that's why it had to leave, basically. And that basically covers all the main changes. So these cards are just kind of weak, and the matchup against especially these Burn Queen decks that race you so hard and finish you off with Burn before you can win the race can only be beaten with like uninteractive heavy hitting and lifesteal, and they have very limited removal, so Silverwing familiar can often be very hard for them to kill, especially once it reaches like 7 health and is out of obliterate range. Then they may be like tortured to pop the Aegis to set up an obliterate, and then by the time they obliterate, we either got it to like 7 health or have like a finest hour to counter the obliterate basically, and then they just lose to it. I've seen this like plenty of times in my games happen. It's just their lack of annihilate and similar stuff makes it really hard for them to deal with it. And the next thing is, sure, they have rapid shot, that's like their way of dealing with big guys, especially big blockers, but the lifesteal on familiar makes it so that we don't have to block. We can just not block if it's not safe to block, and then they attack. Their rapid shot doesn't do much other than deal us 4 damage to the face, which usually is not going to be enough thanks to the lifesteal. So we can afford to just not play into their rapid shot as you normally have to, and then they have very limited options of dealing with like a big unit that is not blocking and just attacking them to win the game. So that is basically how this deck works and how this deck beats these Stone Scar decks. Alright, that's it for the deck tech. As usual, I'm gonna hop into a couple of games with the deck to show it to you in action. I'm not quite master yet again, but I am close. I'm like in mid Diamond 2, so you can join me for climbing closer to master with this deck to show you how it's performing. So stay tuned for the first half of the games in a second.